A man holds up a torn canvas wagon cover, sunlight pouring through the rip like a wound. Behind him, a woman threads a needle thick as a nail, her hands steady where his shake. He wanted lace at the windows. She is about to stitch a failing ranch back together, one stubborn seam at a time, and nobody believes she can. The Wyoming morning came gray over the Sweetwater Valley in the spring of 1887. Wendell Carver stood at the depot platform, hat in hand, watching the train shudder to a halt. His neighbor Pruitt clapped his shoulder and said, "A wife's worth ain't in what she promises, it's in what she fixes when nobody's looking." Wendell only half heard him. He was looking for a woman who could sew curtains, mend shirts, make his cold cabin look like a home worth coming back to. The Carver Ranch sat 11 miles south of town, 400 acres of grass and sage that Wendell had bought cheap because the previous owner had let it fall to ruin. The barn leaned. The corral fence sagged where the posts had rotted. Every wagon cover on the place was split, every tent patched and resplit, every grain sack leaking a thin trail of oats across the yard. Wendell ran 60 head of cattle and a string of horses, and he ran them on hope more than money. He was 34 and had lived alone since coming west, and the loneliness had worn grooves in him. His hired men, Otis and young Briggs, slept in the bunkhouse and ate what Wendell burned over the stove. The cabin had 2 rooms, bare windows, a plank floor that needed sweeping, and shirts piled in a corner with their elbows gone through. Wendell had written to an agency in St. Louis because a man in his position did what men in his position did. He had asked, in plain words, for a woman who could keep a house, who could sew curtains and mend and make things proper. The letters that came back were signed Martha Bell. She wrote a fine, even hand. She said she was 29, that she had buried no husband but had nursed a sick mother for 9 years until the woman passed, that she knew how to work and did not fear it. She did not say she was pretty, and she did not say she was sweet. She said she could sew anything that could be sewn. Wendell had read that line and thought of curtains. Now the train doors opened and the passengers came down, and Wendell searched the faces, a drummer with a sample case, a family with 3 children, and then a woman, alone in a brown traveling dress, gone soft at the seams, carrying a carpet bag in one hand and a long wooden box in the other. She was tall, her face was plain and calm, and her eyes moved over the platform the way a person reads a page, taking in the rot and the dust and the leaning of things, and finding the place where it all might be mended. She set the wooden box down with care, as though it held something living, and put out her hand. "Mr. Carver," she said, "I'm Martha. I'd like to see the place before I decide anything." They reached the ranch as the light went long. Martha stepped down from the wagon and turned a slow circle, and Wendell waited for the disappointment, the tears, the request to be taken back to the depot. It did not come. She walked to the nearest wagon parked by the barn and laid her hand flat against its torn canvas cover. She worked 2 fingers into the rip and widened it, studying the weave, the rot, the place where the old patches had pulled free. "This whole valley," she said, half to herself, "is bleeding money through holes nobody's mending." Wendell said the curtains could wait, that he'd hang oilcloth at the windows soon enough. Martha looked at him as if he'd said something in a foreign tongue. Then she opened the long wooden box. Inside lay needles, awls, waxed thread, palm guards, shears, a sailmaker's kit, complete. "I don't follow," Wendell said. Martha lifted a curved needle from the box and held it to the dying light. "My father was a sailmaker in Boston before he went inland and married my mother. He made and mended the canvas that drove ships across oceans. He taught me before I could read." She set the needle down. "Curtains I can make in an afternoon, Mr. Carver, and they'll be pretty, and they'll keep out exactly nothing that matters. But that wagon cover is the difference between dry grain and rotted grain. That tent is the difference between your men sleeping or sickening. I can sew curtains. I'd rather sew the things that keep this place alive." Wendell took off his hat and turned it in his hands. This was not the bargain he'd written for. A man's wife sewed curtains and mended shirts. She did not crawl under wagons with an awl. He thought of what Pruitt would say, what Otis and Briggs would say, what the whole valley would say, when word got around that Carver's bride was doing the work of a harness shop instead of keeping his house. Folks'll talk, he said. Folks talk whether you give them cause or not, Martha said. I've found it's cheaper to give them no money and let them talk than to give them money and have them praise you. He almost smiled at that. Almost. The house, he said. It still wants keeping. And I'll keep it, she said. I'll cook and I'll clean and I'll mend your shirts, and you'll not go ragged. But I won't sit idle by a window with a hoop in my lap while everything outside it falls to pieces. That's not the woman who wrote you those letters. If you wanted that woman, you'd best say so now, and I'll go back on tomorrow's train, and we'll both call it an honest mistake. The sun was gone behind the ridge. In the blue dusk, her face was steady, asking nothing, offering everything she actually was and not one thing more. Wendell thought of the long, empty cabin and the piled shirts and the sound of his own boots on the plank floor at night. He thought of the rot eating his gear faster than his cattle could earn against it. He thought, against his own stubborn grain, that perhaps a man who'd let his ranch fall this far was in no position to turn away the only hand offered him. "Stay," he said. "We'll see how it sits." Martha closed the wooden box. "It'll sit fine," she said. "Show me where the worst of it is." They were married in town that Saturday by a circuit preacher with Pruitt and his wife for witnesses. It was a quiet thing, more handshake than wedding, and afterward Martha bought 8 yards of heavy duck canvas and 4 spools of waxed linen thread at the mercantile, counting her own saved coins onto the counter before Wendell could reach for his. The storekeeper, a narrow man named Lyle Dunmore, watched her load the canvas into the wagon and said nothing, but his mouth did something unkind at the corner. That evening, back at the ranch, Martha did not unpack her dresses first. She unpacked the sailmaker's box. She set it on the kitchen table where another woman might have set a vase, and she sharpened her shears. The grandmother of the valley was a widow named Ada Foss, who ran 40 hens and a sharp tongue 3 miles up the creek. She came calling the second week with a basket of eggs and a frank stare, and she found Martha in the yard restitching a saddle's torn skirt. "So you're the one," Ada said. "That woke curtains. I'll sew yours if you've a window wants dressing." Ada barked a laugh. "Lord, no. I want to know if you can fix a grain sack. I lose half a bushel a season through mouse holes I'm too old to chase." "Bring them," Martha said. "I'll show you." Word of the sailmaker's wife did get around, exactly as Wendell had feared, but it did not get around the way he'd expected. It started small, the way most true things do. Martha began with the wagon covers because the wagon covers were dying fastest. She spread the worst of them across the barn floor, swept clean, and went over every inch on her hands and knees, marking the rot and the strain points with a stub of chalk. Where the canvas was merely torn, she sewed it closed with a flat seam that lay smooth and shed water. Where it was rotted through, she cut the bad cloth away entire and set in a patch of new duck, lapping the edges so the rain ran off instead of pooling at a ridge. She waxed every seam with a lump of beeswax and tallow she'd melted together, drawing the thread through it so each stitch sealed itself as she pulled it tight. Otis watched her the first morning with his arms folded and his opinion plain on his face. Briggs, who was 19 and had not yet learned to hide what he thought, said outright that he'd never seen a man's work done by a woman on her knees in a barn and that it didn't seem fitting. Martha did not look up from her seam. "Hand me that awl by your boot," she said, "and you'll have done a fitting thing yourself." Briggs handed her the awl. He stayed to watch. By noon, he was holding the canvas taut while she stitched, and by the end of the week he could whip a torn edge well enough that it held, though not so neat as hers. The first wagon cover she finished went back on the grain wagon, and that night a hard spring rain came down the valley in sheets. In the morning, Wendell went out expecting the oats soaked and ruined, the way they'd been ruined 3 times the year before. He pulled back the cover and put his hand into the grain. Dry to the bottom, he stood there a long moment with his hand in the dry oats and said nothing. But he came in to breakfast and ate 2 helpings and looked at his wife twice. She moved through the gear of the ranch the way a doctor moves through a ward. The tents came next, 2 of them, used when the men rode out to the far grass in summer to watch the cattle. Both leaked at every seam, and one had a hole a dog could jump through. Martha rebuilt them. She reseamed the roofs with a double-felled seam that locked the cloth together so no thread showed to rot in the weather. She sewed in new sodcloth at the bottoms and reinforced the corners where the guy ropes pulled, setting in leather patches so the canvas would not tear at the strain. Then the saddle gear. A Western stock saddle is a thing of many parts, and on the Carver place most of those parts were splitting. The cinches were frayed to threads. The latigos had cracked. The saddle skirts had torn loose at the bars where the sweat and the years had rotted the stitching. Martha could not work leather like a saddler with proper tools, but she could stitch, and stitching was 3/4 of what the gear needed. She bought a saddler's awl and a roll of harness thread, and she sewed the skirts back to the trees, doubled the failing cinches with new webbing, and stitched the saticos where they'd begun to part. A new cinch from the saddler in town cost $2.50. She made each old one serve another season for the price of thread. The grain sacks she did by the dozen. Ada Foss brought hers, and then Ada's neighbor brought a few, and Martha sat at the kitchen table in the evenings and closed the mouse holes and the worn-through corners with a quick, tight stitch, and the sacks that would have been thrown out held grain again. She kept account of it. That was the thing Wendell did not expect. She kept a small ledger in the same fine, even hand she'd written her letters in, and on one side she put what a thing would have cost to replace, and on the other what it had cost her in thread and time to mend. New wagon cover, $9. Mended, 60 cents. New tent, $14. Rebuilt, $1.25. Cinch, $2.50. Mended, a dime. The column on the right was so much shorter than the column on the left that the first time Wendell read it, he thought she'd made a mistake in the figures. She had not made a mistake. By the start of summer, the Carver Ranch did not look like a place that was bleeding money through holes. The wagon covers shed rain. The tents stood tight against the wind on the far grass. The horses wore gear that held, and the men, who had started by folding their arms and offering opinions, had stopped folding their arms. Otis was the slowest to turn, being the oldest and the surest of how the world was ordered. But Otis had a particular grief, and the grief was a canvas tarpaulin that had covered his late wife's good furniture on the wagon when he'd come west 11 years before, and which he'd kept folded in the bunkhouse ever since, though it had long gone to rags. He brought it to Martha one evening, without quite meeting her eye, and asked if there was anything to be done with it, knowing there likely wasn't. Martha spread it out and went over it the way she went over everything, and she found that the center cloth, the part that had been folded inward all those years, was sound. It was only the edges that had perished. She cut the good cloth from the ruined, and she built from it a smaller tarp, whole and strong, bound at the edges with new duck and sewn so it would last another 20 years. "It's not the same," she told Otis, "but it's the same cloth. The part that mattered kept." Otis took it and looked at it a long while, and then folded it up careful and carried it back to the bunkhouse, and he did not fold his arms at her again. The thing spread beyond the ranch the way water finds the low ground. Pruitt came over with a wagon cover. Then, a rancher named Halloran from the north end of the valley brought 4, having heard from Pruitt. Then a freighter passing through with a split tarpaulin and a schedule to keep herd. There was a woman in the Sweetwater who could mend canvas faster and cheaper than the harness shop in Casper, and he turned off the road to find her. Martha began to charge. Not much, she set her prices low enough that a man would think it foolish to drive to town and pay the saddler when she could do it for a quarter the cost. But the quarters and the half-dollars added up, and she kept them in a tin separate from the ranch money, and she kept her ledger. Briggs became her apprentice without either of them naming it so. The boy had quick hands, and once he'd gotten past the notion that the work was beneath him, he took to it with a hunger. Martha taught him the flat seam and the felled seam and the round seam for rope work, taught him to wax his thread and set his stitches even, taught him to read a piece of canvas and know where it would fail next so he could stop the failure before it started. By midsummer, Briggs could recover a wagon nearly as well as she could, and he wore the fact like a medal. And when the other young men teased him about doing women's work, he told them flatly how much money the women's work had saved the Carver Ranch, and the figures shut their mouths. Wendell watched all of this with a feeling he could not name. He had wanted a wife to keep his house, and his house was kept. The cabin was clean now, the shirts were mended, there was bread rising and a kettle on, and the plank floor swept. Martha had done all she'd promised about the house, and done it well. But she had done this other thing besides, this larger thing, and it had begun to change not only the ranch, but the way the valley spoke of the Carver place. Men who had pitied him now asked his advice. Men who had thought him a poor manager now noticed that his gear held when theirs failed, that his grain stayed dry, that his outfit went into the hard months ready instead of ragged. One evening, Wendell found her at the table with her ledger and the tin of coins, and he stood behind her chair and looked over her shoulder at the columns of figures. "You've saved this place more than the cattle earned this spring," he said. It was not quite a question. "Closer than you'd think," Martha said. "But yes. The cattle earned $41 clear after the feed and the wages. The needle saved better than 90, counting what we didn't have to buy and what others paid me to mend." Wendell was quiet a moment. "I wanted curtains," he said. "I know," said Martha. "I was a fool." "You were a man who didn't know yet what he had," she said. "That's a different thing, and it mends." The county fair came in August, in the town of Sweetwater Crossing, and with it came the news that the railroad, the Wyoming Central, pushing a spur line up from the south, was bringing a survey crew and a construction camp into the valley by autumn. 100 men. Tents, wagon covers, tarpaulins, harness, grain sacks by the hundred, all of it bound to wear and tear, and split under hard use far from any city. Martha heard it standing at the fair with her tin of coins grown heavy in her apron and her ledger fat with figures, and she understood at once what it meant. Here was not a season's worth of mending. Here was a year's. Here, if she could get it, was the making of the ranch entire. She also saw Lyle Dunmore hear it and go still. Lyle Dunmore owned the mercantile in Sweetwater Crossing, and he had owned it long enough to believe the valley owed him its trade. He sold canvas by the yard, and harness by the piece and grain sacks by the dozen, and he sold them dear because his was the only store within 40 miles, and a man who needs a thing buys it where he can. The railroad camp was, to Dunmore's mind, a gift dropped into his lap. 100 men who would wear out their gear and have to buy new, all of it from him, at whatever price he chose to mark. He had not counted on the sailmaker's wife. When the construction camp came up the valley in September and pitched its tents along the survey line, the camp's quartermaster was a practical man named Sturgis, whose business it was to keep 100 men fed and sheltered on a budget set by men in an office in Cheyenne. He needed his gear kept up. A torn tent in October weather meant sick men, and sick men meant a slowed line, and a slowed line meant questions he did not want to answer. When he heard there was someone in the valley who could mend canvas and harness on the spot faster and cheaper than freighting new gear up from the railhead, he sent a man to find her. The man found Martha. And Martha, with Briggs now near as skilled as she was, and Ada Foss's 2 grown granddaughters willing to learn the simple seams, made Sturgis an offer. She would keep the camp's canvas and gear in repair through the building season, on contract, for a set monthly sum. She named a figure. It was fair. better than fair by the standards of the harness shop in Casper, and Sturgis, who had expected to pay twice that or freight gear a week's travel, took it on the spot. Dunmore heard of the contract within a day, and it galled him to the bone. He had marked his canvas up for the railroad trade. Now the railroad would buy little canvas because a woman with a needle was making the old canvas last. He sat in the back of his store and did his sums and did not like them. And being a man who, when he did not like his sums, looked for someone to blame rather than something to fix, he set about undoing Martha Bell. He began with talk, because talk was free. He let it be known, in the careful way of a man who never quite says the thing outright, that there was something unseemly about a married woman taking contracts and handling money and going out to a camp of railroad men. He wondered aloud whether Wendell Carver knew what his wife got up to. He hinted that the work she did was shoddy, that canvas mended was canvas that would fail at the worst moment, that a man who trusted his outfit to a patched seam was a fool waiting to be soaked. Some of it stuck, the way mud will. A few of the older men in the valley, who shared Otis's first instinct about the order of the world, nodded along, and the talk reached Sturgis as Dunmore meant it to, carried by a teamster who owed Dunmore money and wanted his goodwill. Sturgis was not a man swayed by gossip about seemliness, but he was a man who could not afford failed gear, and the word that Martha's work was shoddy gave him pause. He had signed a contract on the strength of a recommendation and a fair price. He had not yet seen, with his own eyes, how the mended canvas held under real weather and real use. And then, in the first week of October, real weather came. An early storm rolled down out of the mountains. 3 days of cold rain turning to sleet, the kind of weather that finds every weakness in a man's shelter and exploits it. The camp hunkered down, and on the second night, in the worst of it, two of the big mess tents that Martha had re-seamed the week before stood the test. But a third tent, one Dunmore had sold the camp new in September, split along a factory seam and came down in the dark, soaking the camp's flour and three men's bedrolls. By the cruel logic of how blame travels, the failure did not at first land on Dunmore, who had sold the tent, but threatened to land on Martha, who kept the camp's canvas. In the gray, miserable morning after the tent came down, with the flour ruined and the men cold and short-tempered, the story that ran through the camp was simply that a tent had failed, and the woman was responsible for the tents, and therefore the woman's work had failed. The teamster in Dunmore's debt made sure the story ran that way. Sturgis came to find Martha with his jaw set and the cold contract in his mind. He found her already at the camp. She had ridden out at first light through the tail of the storm, Briggs beside her, because she'd heard a tent was down and she did not wait to be sent for. She was standing over the collapsed tent when Sturgis reached her, and she had it half spread in the mud, and she was looking at the seam that had let go. "This is going to cost us a day's work and a barrel of flour," Sturgis said, "and I'm told it's your charge." Martha did not flinch and did not argue. She knelt in the mud and took the failed seam in both hands and held it up so he could see it. "Look here," she said. "This seam I never touched. This is a factory seam, single-stitched, no felling, no wax. You can see the threads not waxed. It's wicked the water straight through and rotted in a season. The two tents that held through the night are the ones I reseamed. I doubled them and felled them and waxed every stitch. Same storm, same wind. The difference is the seam." She ran her thumb along the failed stitching. "Whoever sold you this tent sold you a thing built to fail the first hard rain. I'd have caught it if you'd given it me to look over. It came up new in September, and nobody thought it wanted mending." Sturgis crouched beside her. He was not a sentimental man, but he was a fair one, and he had kept gear long enough to read a seam himself when it was shown to him. He looked at the waxed, doubled, felled seams of the standing tents, dark with rain but tight and whole. He looked at the dry, single, unwaxed thread of the failed one, rotted and parted. And he understood, plainly and at once, that he had been told the story backward. "Who sold us this tent?" he asked. That you'd have to ask your own books, Martha said. I only mend what comes to my hands. But Briggs, standing by with his quick tongue and his loyalty up, said, It was Dunmore's mercantile, sir. Same as sold you the flour, I'd wager, and marked it dear. Sturgis stood. He was quiet a moment, the rain dripping off his hat brim. Then he said, I've heard a deal of talk this past week about Mrs. Carver's work. I'm beginning to think the talk and the tent came from the same place. He had his men gather every piece of canvas in the camp, the mended and the new alike, and he laid them out. And he and Martha went over them together, seam by seam. Every piece Martha had touched held. Several pieces Dunmore had sold new, when Sturgis looked at them with opened eyes, showed the same single dry seam waiting to fail. By the end of that gray morning, Sturgis had not only renewed his faith in the contract, he doubled it. He gave Martha the whole of the camp's canvas, new and old, to inspect and re-seam as she judged fit. And he struck Dunmore's mercantile from his list of suppliers, and sent to the railhead for canvas from another house. It should have ended there, with Dunmore's scheme collapsed under the weight of its own shoddy seam. But Dunmore was not finished. He was a creditor as well as a storekeeper, and he held paper around the valley, small debts, store accounts let run on. And he held one such account, Martha learned that week, that he had bought up quietly from the previous owner of a certain 400 acres along the Sweetwater. He held a note on the Carver Ranch. Dunmore came out to the ranch himself, on a fine horse, with the note in a leather folder and a smile that did not reach his eyes. The previous owner had borrowed against the place years back and never cleared it. Dunmore had bought the debt for pennies, betting the ranch would fail. Now he called it due. The whole sum, $312, payable within 30 days, or he would take the land. It was more cash money than the Carver Ranch had seen in one place in its life. The cattle would not sell for it. The season's earnings did not approach it. Wendell stood on his own porch holding the paper and felt the ground he'd fought for tilting out from under his boots. Dunmore rode away smiling. That night the cabin was very quiet. Wendell sat at the table, with the note flattened before him and the lamp guttering, and he did not eat. He had come west with nothing, and built this place out of nothing. And a man behind a counter who had never broken sod in his life was going to take it with a piece of paper bought for pennies, and there was nothing in the cattle or the grass or the bank to stop him. I should never have let the place fall so far, he said. If I'd kept it up proper, kept clear of debt. But the note was here before me. It was buried in the deed, and I never knew. 30 days. We can't make $300 in 30 days. No ranch could. Martha did not say anything for a while. She sat across from him with her ledger closed under her folded hands, and she looked not beaten but very still, the way she went still when she was reading a torn thing to find where it would mend. You're figuring it like a rancher, she said at last quietly. 30 days of cattle and grass. And you're right, there's no $300 in cattle and grass. Then how else is there to figure it? Martha opened her ledger. She turned it to the page where the two columns ran, the long one and the short one, and she set her finger at the bottom of the short one. Figure it like a sailmaker, she said. She talked half the night, and by the time the lamp burned out, Wendell had stopped looking like a man, watching the ground tilt. The railroad camp would build through the autumn and into the winter. 100 men, 1,000 pieces of gear, every one of it wearing out far from any store now that Dunmore was struck from the list. Sturgis had doubled the contract already, and there was more work than Martha and Briggs and Ada's granddaughters could do alone. We don't fight him for the $300, Martha said. We earn it with needles, and we make him hand it to us himself. In the morning, Martha rode to the railroad camp and asked to see Sturgis, and she laid before him a proposition larger than the one she'd made in September. The camp would build all autumn and winter. Its gear would wear out steadily, far from any supplier. New canvas, new harness, new sacks freighted up from the railhead cost dear and came slow. What if, Martha proposed, she did not merely mend the camp's gear piece by piece as it failed, but ran a proper repair shop for the whole line? A canvas works here in the valley, staffed and stocked, that would keep 100 men's gear sound through the building season for a set price that would still save the railroad more than freighting new. Sturgis, who answered to men in Cheyenne who loved nothing better than a saved dollar shown plainly in a column, asked her to put numbers to it. Martha had brought her ledger. She showed him the long column and the short column. She showed him what new gear cost and what mended gear cost, and what the difference came to, multiplied across 100 men and 4 months of hard winter use. The figure at the bottom was large enough that Sturgis read it twice, the way Wendell had once read it twice. He gave her the contract that afternoon in writing, signed, a sum paid monthly for the repair of all the line's gear in the valley through the building season, with the first month's payment advanced against the cost of setting up. Canvas, thread, leather, wax, and the wages of the hands she'd hire. The advance alone was $140. Martha set up her canvas works in the Carver barn, which Otis and Wendell had spent a week making weather-tight and sound. She hired Briggs as her foreman and Ada Foss's 2 grown granddaughters as stitchers, and she took on 3 more women from the valley who had needles and willing hands and households that could use the wages. Women whose work until now no one had thought to pay for. She taught them the seams. She set them to the camp's gear, and the gear came in torn and went out sound, and the monthly payments came in steady, and the tin that had once held quarters now held banknotes. She kept her ledger through all of it, and the short column, the one that had started with a wagon cover mended for 60 cents, grew at the bottom into a sum that climbed past $100, then past 200, as the autumn turned and the work poured in. Dunmore's 30 days ran out on the last Saturday of October. He came out to the ranch that morning on his fine horse, with the leather folder and the smile, expecting to find a broken man and an empty till, and a ranch he could fold into his holdings for the price of pennies. He had spent the month telling the valley that Carver was finished. He found the yard full of wagons. He found the barn doors open and the sound of a dozen needles and the snap of waxed thread drawn tight, and women working at long tables, and Briggs directing the loading of a freight wagon stacked with mended canvas bound for the railroad camp. He found Wendell on the porch, not broken, and Martha beside him with her ledger and a cloth sack heavy in her 2 hands. "I've come to call the note," Dunmore said, but his voice had lost its certainty, because the place he'd expected to find dying was plainly more alive than it had ever been. "We know what you've come for," Martha said. $312. She set the sack on the porch rail and opened it, and she counted it out in front of him. The banknotes from the railroad contract, the months of quarters and half-dollars from the valley's mending, the advance and the first month's payment and the second, all of it earned with needles, counted out coin by coin and note by note onto the rail until it made the full sum and $3 over. 315, Martha said. "The extras so you'll not have to make change, and so there's no question it's paid in full. Wendell, you'll want the note." Wendell took the leather folder from Dunmore's hands. Dunmore let it go without quite meaning to. Too thrown to hold it, and he drew out the note and read it through, and Sturgis, who had ridden out at Martha's asking to witness the thing done properly, read it after him, and nodded that it was the genuine paper. Then Wendell, with great deliberation, tore it in two, and in two again, and let the pieces fall. "Paid in full," Wendell said. "You'll write it so in your book, and you'll write a receipt before you leave this porch, and Mr. Sturgis here will witness your hand." Dunmore wrote the receipt. His hand was not steady. While he wrote, Sturgis spoke up, not unkindly but plainly, in the voice of a man who keeps accounts and does not forget what's in them. "You sold my camp a tent that failed in the first storm, and near cost me 3 men to the cold," Sturgis said. "And you spent a month telling this valley that Mrs. Carver's work was shoddy. I've gear in my camp now that says otherwise, and a column of figures that says the Canvas Works has saved my line more money than your store ever did it good. I'll be telling that as plainly as you told the other thing. A man's trade rests on his name, Mr. Dunmore. You'd do well to mind yours. Dunmore finished the receipt and handed it over, and got on his fine horse and rode back to town, and the valley did hear the whole of it, because Sturgis told it, and Ada Foss told it, and Briggs told it best of all. And Dunmore's Mercantile, which had counted on the railroad trade to make its year, found that the valley had learned to look hard at a seam before it paid for one, and learned, too, that the woman he'd tried to ruin had built a thing that paid its workers and saved its customers and was not going anywhere. By the new year, the Canvas Works employed 6 women and Briggs, held contracts with the railroad and half the ranches in the valley, and had cleared, after every cost, more money than the Carver cattle had earned in 3 seasons put together. On a bright, cold morning in the new year, Wendell stood at the window of the cabin and looked out at the barn, where the lamps were already lit and the needles already going, and at the yard, where a freight wagon waited under a canvas cover his wife's hands had made whole. Behind him, the windows of the cabin wore curtains at last. Martha had made them one quiet Sunday, blue gingham, neat and pretty, just as he'd once asked. He'd been glad of them. But he found he no longer thought of them as the measure of anything. The measure was the sound behind the barn doors. The measure was the long, short column at the bottom of her ledger. The measure was a ranch-sewn hole, one stubborn seam at a time.